What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Tuesday, July 9th edition of the Ship My Money Show. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. We have an 11-game MLB slate tonight, at least 4 right now. There are a couple of games with pretty significant weather concerns, so we could lose those. But one way or the other, we're going to have a pretty nice size slate tonight. Should be pretty interesting to walk through. We're going to, as always, look at some of the top pitching, some of the top hitting on the slate, which stacks are showing up as the most optimal, and all of that stuff. If you have questions, throw them in chat throughout the show. I'll answer the ones that I can, whether they're related to DFS in general or the slate specifically. Happy to see those. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel so you get notification when shows go live. All of that stuff helps out quite a bit as well. Diving into the first game, we have the Nats taking on the New York Mets in New York. This game is not one of the ones with weather concerns. Looks like, at least for right now, it should be pretty good. We have Jake Irvin going for the Nats, Jose Quintana pitching for the Mets. Neither pitcher looks all that good from a DFS standpoint. Jake Irvin is having a solid year for the Nats. He's made some improvements, but we have good pitching on this slate. He has a 22.7% K percentage, 3.61 xFIP, but he's up to $9,100. It's not the best matchup here against the Mets, although it is a good park to pitch in. The Mets active roster ranks 18th in strikeout percentage this year, 113 WRC plus against right-handed pitching. There are plenty of slates where I would be interested in Irvin. This just isn't really one of them because of how many other good options we're going to have. On the other side, Quintana, 6,900, pretty cheap price tag. If you need a value pitcher in large field tournaments and you land on him a little bit, that's fine. But again, there's just plenty of good pitching on this slate. And there's, anywhere, depending on how many games we actually end up with, anywhere from like 18 to 22 offenses. So it's not going to be difficult to find value bats. You're probably just not going to need to pay down for Quintana and sacrifice that upside that you can get from other pitchers. So I don't anticipate getting to either of the pitchers all that much here, but also not a very good park for hitting. Washington showing up middle of the pack as far as stacks go. The Mets are quite a bit below them, and that makes sense. The Mets do have this difficult matchup with Irvin, or at least relatively difficult matchup with Irvin. The matchup for the Nats is a bit better. You do also have just some value in that Nats lineup. CJ Abrams is pretty expensive at 6,300, but outside of that, the Nats aren't that expensive. Thomas also expensive at 5,600, but Juan Yepez, if he's in the lineup, only 2,400, does come with pretty significant pinch hit risk, though. Pretty good chance he's not in the game once Quintana leaves, so not somebody that I'd want to be going too crazy getting to. Harold Ramirez, 3,400 is cheap, but again, there's some pinch hit risk there. James Wood, lefty, but obviously a ton of upside for him at 4,200. Overall, though, just not a game offensively that I expect to get much of. Not a game pitching-wise that I expect to get much of. It's just a game that I don't think I'm going to end up with much exposure to. You can see here that nobody is showing up all that often as far as optimal percentages go. Nobody's getting that much ownership in this game either. Next, we have a game that does have weather concerns in Cincinnati. The Rockies taking on the Reds. This game was pretty underwhelming yesterday until like the 8th inning. The Reds tacked on, I think, 4 runs against the Rockies bullpen after being shut down for most of the game by Ryan Feltner. This game, like I said, does have weather concerns, I believe, double checking that now. But yeah, seems like a game that nothing's definitive right now. It's not likely to be a complete washout, at least at this point in time. So we will have to pay attention to it as we get closer to lock, but definitely a game to keep an eye on. If it does go, we have Nick Lodolo on the mound for Cincinnati in a good spot. Accidentally didn't include him when I ran this before the show, but he is a good strikeout pitcher. He has a 25.1% K percentage this season, 3.74 xFIP. A good overall pitcher in a good matchup here. Tough park to pitch in, but other than that, everything will look pretty good for him. Not sure why or how I missed him when I ran this, but it is a good matchup against Colorado. We saw Andrew Abbott tear them up yesterday. Lodolo is a better strikeout pitcher, better pitcher overall than Abbott is. So I would be expecting to get to him. He most recently pitched on June 23rd, threw 77 pitches there, was on the injured list with a finger injury, skipped his rehab assignment. So I'm assuming he's not going to be significantly limited. Like maybe he's not going to throw, 105 pitches or anything, but I think you're probably getting pretty close to a full workload from him. It's not like it was a legitimate injury. He's only $8,800. So he is going to look like a pretty good option if the weather in this game cooperates. Cal Quantrill on the other side, less so. Does have a pretty decent matchup against the Reds, just in terms of them being a team that will strike out against right-handed pitching and a team that is below average overall offensively. But Quantrill, not a good strikeout pitcher at all, and we have plenty of good pitching on this slate. Only striking out 17.5% of hitters, 4.4 xFIP so far this season. So not the worst pitcher as far as limiting production, but just not somebody that I expect to get a lot of from a DFS standpoint. Looking at the Reds, it's not the best matchup. It is a good park. Quantrill only allowing a 138 expected ISO to lefties, 135 to righties this year, so he has done a good job limiting power. One thing he's not very good at is controlling or preventing stolen bases. He's not awful at it. There's certainly guys that are a lot worse, but he does allow stolen bases, and that is a problem when you face this Reds team. Obviously, Ellie De La Cruz will run at will against pretty much anybody, but it does set up as a good stolen base spot for him. But Spencer Steer steals bases. India can run. Benson can run. There are a lot of guys in this lineup that will steal bases, and the Quantrill's not particularly good at slowing that down. So there is a little bit of added upside here for the Reds when it comes to stolen bases that maybe makes up for some of the lack of power that Quantrill's allowed this year. And then on top of that, behind Quantrill, you don't have a very good bullpen. We were reminded of that last night as well. So the Reds do have a nice ceiling in this park, in this stolen base spot. The ownership is there for the most part. I think De La Cruz is going a little bit under-owned in the good stolen base matchup. Right now, only projected around 8% ownership. Showed up as optimal about 12% of the time for me, despite the very expensive price tag. So that's a spot that I'll like get into, whether it is as a part of stacks or individually. Cincinnati overall showing up third most often in stacks for me, but 5-man stacks are further down the list. So I think it's likely that I'm just getting to like 2-mans, 3-mans, targeting those stolen bases, targeting a couple of guys in this park as opposed to full stacking, at least the way it looks right now. But I do like this stolen base spot for the Reds. For Colorado on the other side, I don't have much interest there. Lodolo's a good pitcher. It is a good park, but this team's not very good at hitting. It's a much bigger slate than yesterday when I was interested in them against a very popular Abbott. So I think it's pretty tough to want to get to the Rockies. Oakland taking on the Red Sox in Boston. Nice park upgrade for the A's going up against Brian Bayo. Joey Estes pitching for Oakland. No real interest in Estes. I do have some interest in Bayo. Only 8K in a good strikeout matchup against Oakland. As I mentioned, they do get the nice park upgrade. They do have power in their lineup, but they have a 26.9% K percentage against right-handed pitching so far this season. That is the second highest in baseball. So it sets up as an above average, well above average strikeout spot for Bayo. Overall this season, only about a 20.5% strikeout percentage. But he does have a 3.87 xFIP. He does generally do a pretty good job of limiting power, keeping the ball on the ground. Righties only have a 124 expected ISO against him. Fenway Park does play up right-handed power more than left-handed power. Also, most of the hitters on Oakland that you think of when you're thinking about power are right-handed as well. Shea Langoliers, Brent Rooker, Zach Galoff. These guys all hit from the right side. So it sets up overall as a pretty good matchup for Bayo. I think getting in that like 15% range makes sense. For the Red Sox, very high implied run total here. They're showing up a lot. They are expected to be pretty popular. Rafael Devers at 6,200 certainly looks good if you can find the salary for him. So far this season, lefties have a 267 expected ISO with just a 15% strikeout percentage against Joey Estes. So even though this park does play up left-handed or right-handed power more than left-handed power, looking to somebody like Rafael Devers is still very appealing. Jarren Duran having a fantastic season gives you stolen base upside in addition to whatever he does at the plate. He is very expensive, but if you can afford him, still looks good in this spot. Wilyer Abreu is pretty cheap at 4,100 with the platoon advantage against Estes. I don't mind getting to like Tyler O'Neill, even though it's righty-righty, just because he does have power and he's in Fenway Park. But Devers, Duran, Abreu all look like pretty high priorities for me. David Hamilton's gotten really expensive. He does have second base shortstop eligibility and stolen base upside, but that salary is a little bit prohibitive. Devers, Duran, Abreu all look pretty good. Want to check the Oakland bullpen quickly as well, just to see what they have as far as relievers go. They do have 3 lefties in their bullpen with TJ McFarland, Scott Alexander, and Kyle Muller. All of them should be available today. So that is a little bit of a downgrade for Devers, Abreu, Duran. Not that you're expecting those guys to get pinch hit for. Devers and Duran certainly not going anywhere. Abreu probably not. Maybe you get like Ref Snyder pinch hitting if it's a really clutch spot late in the game. But you do have the A's with the ability to match up later in the game from a platoon standpoint. So a little bit of a downgrade there, but still a pretty good spot for those guys. Again, Oakland, I'm not overly interested in getting to. They don't match up particularly well with Bayo. You can make the case that Langoliers just has a ton of power. And with it being a nice park upgrade going into Fenway, you're getting a cheap, pretty low-owned catcher that can just hit a lot of home runs. So that is pretty appealing, but the matchup itself against Bayo doesn't look all that great. Next, we have Kansas City playing the Cardinals at Busch Stadium. This game looks pretty unlikely to happen. Obviously, it's early in the day. We'll have to keep an eye on it as the day goes on, but this looks like one of the more likely games to get postponed. So I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but if it does go, not much interest in the pitching here. Michael Wacha taking on Andre Payante. Payante doesn't really strike anybody out, so pretty easy to cross off, or at least come as close to crossing somebody off in DFS as I ever do, in a pretty tough strikeout matchup with Kansas City as well. Wacha, if this game goes, if somehow magically the rain just evaporates and there's no delay concerns, secondary pitching option at best in your large field tournament lineups. It's not a terrible matchup against the Cardinals. They rank 10th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching. They do have a 111 WRC plus, though. And as I've mentioned a couple times already, you just have very good pitching on the slate. So I'm not really interested in the pitchers here. I'm not overly interested in the offenses either. You can see neither team showing up a lot as far as stacks go. Neither pitcher is terrible. The park's not great for hitting. Implied run totals in this game are pretty low. It goes without saying that if you find a way to get Bobby Witt Jr. or Salvador Perez or Wilson Contreras into your lineup, any of those guys are perfectly fine. They are really good hitters. Bobby Witt Jr. gives you massive stolen base upside as well. But at least right now, we have Witt projected for very, very similar ownership to Elly De La Cruz. I would much rather get to De La Cruz if that holds in a better hitter's park, in a good stolen base matchup. Payante is actually pretty good at preventing stolen bases. So again, Bobby Witt will probably try, but Payante's been good. Payante's been a little bit below average. I was going from memory. Payante's been a little bit below average at controlling the running game, so it is a pretty decent spot for Witt. It is a better spot for De La Cruz as far as stolen bases go, and then obviously a better park to hit in for De La Cruz also. So maybe by lock we see the ownership come up on De La Cruz and come down on Witt. But with the way things are projected right now, I would much rather be getting to De La Cruz, even weather concerns aside. Overall, just not a game that I'm very interested in, and a game that probably isn't going to even play, so it won't matter that I'm not interested. Colin Rea taking on somebody in Milwaukee, apparently X'd whoever this was out of my initial run as well. Quinn Priester, 5,700 on DraftKings, returning from the injured list. Not a good strikeout pitcher, not a good matchup, not a good park. I'm not expecting to be interested in Priester at 5,700. Colin Rea at 7,400 looks okay. Again, if you're playing a lot of lineups, maybe get to him a little bit just because it is a decent matchup against the Pirates. They rank 7th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year at 24%. They have a 90 WRC plus. Colin Rea himself, though, not a very good strikeout pitcher. 16.8% strikeout percentage, 4.53 xFIP. If this were yesterday, I would probably like him quite a bit, but today the pitching is just so much better than it was yesterday. I don't see a lot of reason to get to either of the pitchers here. It is a nice park upgrade for the Pirates. Colin Rea this year only allowing a 143. That's Quinn Priester. Colin Rea this year is allowing a 170 expected ISO to righties, 201 to lefties. So he has given up some power to both sides of the plate. Lefties in particular have done damage against him. That sets up pretty nicely for O'Neal Cruz if he's in the lineup, Brian Reynolds, Jack Sawinski if he's in the lineup, Rowdy Tellez. Now with guys like Tellez and Sawinski, you do have pinch hit risk once you get to the bullpen. Tellez very likely to be swapped out for like Connor Joe, assuming that Joe isn't starting this game. Sawinski can be swapped out for somebody like Edward Olivares, assuming that Olivares isn't starting. Looking at Milwaukee's bullpen, they do have 3 lefties as well that are all available. So I would be cautious here. Obviously we don't have a Pirates lineup. I would be cautious with most of the Pirates lefties because this is a team that does platoon pretty heavily. So like looking at their projected lineup, Rowdy Tellez, a lot of pinch hit risk. Sawinski, Palacios, these guys all have pinch hit risk. I wouldn't be too concerned about O'Neal Cruz if he's in the lineup. Now he's dealing with an injury. John Carlson just said, do I think he plays? I don't have an opinion. Like I don't really put any thought into that because you're going to find out multiple hours before the game. It's not like NBA where it has a massive trickle down effect and you might find out 15 minutes before lock. You're going to know. So I have no idea if he plays, but if he does play, I'm not downgrading him as a huge pinch hit risk guy. But Rowdy Tellez, Sawinski, Palacios, they all come with pretty substantial pinch hit risk, given that the Brewers are going to have no trouble matching up from a lefty-lefty standpoint once it gets to the bullpen. One other thing that does make Pittsburgh look pretty good is that Colin Rea is not good at holding runners. We have a lot of pitchers on this slate that are not good at all at controlling the running game, and we have a few that are extremely good. Rea is one of the ones that is not very good. So if O'Neal Cruz is in the lineup, he is somebody that should benefit from that. Ke'Bryan Hayes also, he's right-handed, so he's not one of the guys that gets the platoon advantage, but Rea does give up some power to righties, and Hayes is arguably the biggest stolen base threat on this team along with Cruz. Those two guys in particular, I do think get a little bit of a bump here in the matchup with Rea from a stolen base standpoint. There are some other guys that'll run too. Brian Reynolds runs a little bit, but Cruz and Hayes are the guys that I think probably get the biggest bump in that regard. For Milwaukee, going up against Quinn Priester, this is a pitcher that doesn't miss a lot of bats. When he's on, he does keep the ball on the ground. But going back to last season, has allowed a 245 expected ISO to lefties, only striking them out 10.5% of the time as well. That is not what you want to see for a pitcher going from pitching his home games in PNC Park in Pittsburgh to pitching here in Milwaukee, where left-handed power is played up. It looks very good for Christian Yelich. Now, he is very expensive at $6K, but if you can find the salary, it looks good. Bryce Turang at $4,900, pretty expensive, but if he's at the top of the lineup, no issues with him as a second baseman. If he's batting ninth, obviously I don't really want to get to him, but I think it's pretty likely that he is leading off here. So any left-handed power against Priester is going to look pretty good. He has been much better at limiting power to righties, only a 126 expected ISO, 19% strikeout percentage in that split. So that's not to say that you can't play Contreras or Adames or Hoskins. Like, these guys still have power. If Priester just isn't on his game, they can do damage. If you're stacking Milwaukee, obviously just play the best hitters, even if they're right-handed. But from just singling out individual hitters, it does look really good for the lefties in particular, Yelich and Turang. So that's worth keeping in mind that Priester has had pretty dramatic splits, and it's not really surprising when you think about him as a low velo guy that typically is looking to keep the ball on the ground, work down in the zone. Guys like that are generally going, right-handed pitchers like that are generally going to struggle more with left-handed power hitters. Taking a quick look at the Pirates bullpen, they have one non-closer lefty, Josh Fleming, should be available. Their other left-handed reliever is Aroldis Chapman. He's obviously not coming in the middle innings, so they can match up a little bit with the lefties, but they only have really one arm to do it in the middle innings, so not as bad as some of these other spots when it comes to that. Miami facing the Astros in Houston. Ronel Blanco is pitching for Houston. For Miami, we have Trevor Rogers, almost called him Taylor, but Trevor Rogers going for Miami. Blanco is 10K, has a good matchup. He's getting some ownership, getting about 14%. Not a bad park to pitch in. Very good matchup overall against Miami. Middle of the pack with a 23.2% K percentage against righties. Only an 88 WRC plus against right-handed pitching. Blanco is a solid pitcher, 23% K percentage, 4.22 xFIP overall this year. The only real issue is the price at 10K. Like, he's not a $10,000 pitcher. If you made him like 8,800 or something, he would look really good here. As is, I think he's going a little bit over-owned at 13 to 14%. He showed up as optimal around 9% of the time for me. On the other side, Trevor Rogers, only 5K. That is, by definition, underpriced for a major league starting pitcher. That being said, I don't think you're going to really need the value on this slate. I would much rather differentiate my lineups by playing contrarian hitters than by playing Rogers against the Astros in a very, very difficult matchup. So I don't think I'm actually going to get there, but he is really cheap if for some reason you just need a 5K pitcher and can't find a better way to build your lineup. He is underpriced, but I don't anticipate actually getting him in lineups. For the offenses, a much better spot for the Astros, obviously a much more talented offense. Rogers has struggled this year as well. He has only struck out 18.2% of hitters, 4.47 xFIP. So from a run prevention standpoint, hasn't been terrible, but he has a lot of 174 expected ISO to righties. He is also below average at controlling the running game, which is a little bit surprising since he is left-handed. He's not terrible, but he's not good either. So guys like Jose Altuve, Jeremy Pena. It sets up, pretty nicely for them since they most likely will attempt to run if they get on base. Yordan Alvarez is questionable. It's lefty-lefty, but if he's back, obviously this Houston stat gets even better because he is such a good hitter regardless of who he's facing. So getting to the Astros, looks decent. They are relatively expensive. Overall, they're looking like a middle-of-the-road stack for me. For Miami, it's tough to want to get to them. Blanco is not getting enough ownership to really drive them up on an 11-game slate, I don't think. Even if it ends up being like a 9-gamer, I don't think that's going to change. And one other thing that is worth noting, Jazz Chisholm obviously is somebody that you can always play from Miami, really regardless of matchup. He gives you stolen base upside. He gives you power upside. But Ronel Blanco has been excellent at holding runners or preventing stolen bases. A lot of Jazz Chisholm's value, especially in a mediocre hitting matchup, does come from his ability to steal bases. He is probably not running on Blanco. So I do think that's a bit of a downgrade for him on top of the fact that Blanco isn't a bad pitcher either. So I'm hesitant to get to Chisholm and obviously even more hesitant to get to anybody else from the Marlins. Twins are facing the White Sox in Chicago. We had a high-scoring game here last night. Decent chance we get another one tonight. But the pitching is a little bit better than it was yesterday, or a lot better than it was yesterday. Bailey Ober going for Minnesota. Eric Fedde on the mound for the White Sox. Ober is the pitcher that I am most interested in here. Has a very good matchup against the White Sox. They're ranked 12th in strikeout percentage, tied for 11th, 23.3%. Only an 84 WRC plus against right-handed pitching. Bailey Ober has one of the highest strikeout percentages on the slate at 26.5%, 3.76 xFIP. Good pitcher overall, good matchup. Happy to get to Bailey Ober. I think that his ownership is pretty much where it should be, getting about 23%, 20% optimal percentage for me. There are weather concerns in this game, though. This looks like the second worst weather game behind St. Louis. We'll have to pay attention to it as the day goes on, but obviously talking about this game as if it's going to happen, Bailey Ober will look good. If it doesn't happen, there's going to be some ownership spread out to other pitchers because we'll be losing Ober. But if it does go, I like Ober quite a bit. Fedde's been a solid pitcher this year, but he does still have a difficult strikeout matchup against Minnesota. They rank 23rd in strikeout percentage, 114 WRC plus against right-handed pitching. I don't really see a need to get to an $8,500 Fedde, whether weather cooperates here or not. So Bailey Ober, the priority if this game goes. Neither offense looks great. Like I said, Fedde has been a much improved pitcher so far this year compared to what he was during his time with the Nats before he went to either Japan or the KBO. I think the KBO. 148 expected ISO to righties, 159 to lefties. He has just done a pretty good job limiting power. He has not been very good at holding runners. So that does set up nicely for somebody like Willie Castro, especially if he's leading off, gets on base. It's at least his first time up. Nobody's on base in front of him. Very likely to attempt to steal. But it's, I think, a pretty mediocre matchup for Minnesota just because Fedde is a pretty decent pitcher. I do like Castro individually because of the stolen base upside, but he has gotten expensive. The rest of Minnesota looks okay. I think they're a middle-of-the-road stack if the weather cooperates. For the White Sox, you can make the negative correlation argument going up against Ober. Ober does allow power. 1.44 home runs allowed per 9 innings so far this season. Righties have a 186 expected ISO against them, 161 expected ISO to lefties. Luis Robert, obviously the biggest home run threat in the White Sox lineup. One slight downgrade for Robert is that Ober is good at preventing stolen bases. He is one of the pitchers on this slate that is very, very good at it. Obviously, you're not just playing Luis Robert for stolen bases because he can hit really well also, but that is part of his fantasy appeal, and he's probably not stealing bases on Bailey Ober, or at least it's going to be difficult to do so. He is still the guy that I would go to first if I'm just looking for a bat against Ober, but it isn't quite as good a spot as it could be for Robert. Stephen Leibowitz said they should sell high on Fedde. Yeah, I would expect Fedde to be moved at the trade deadline. As an O's fan, I am holding out hope that they will move Crochet for a reasonable package. But obviously that also comes with the fact that Crochet is probably going to be limited down the stretch. So by the time the playoffs get here, he might just be a high leverage reliever anyway. Fedde is somebody I can't imagine they don't move. He's affordable. He's good enough. Like, he's the kind of guy that you can get without giving up your entire farm system. And he's going to be an upgrade on starting pitchers for a lot of teams. So I assume they'll move him. I assume they'll get some sort of decent return because he has been solid this year. Going to Anaheim, Texas is facing the Angels. No weather concerns here since this game is in California and they don't get rain. Yeah, no weather concerns here, so don't have to worry about that in this one. Max Scherzer pitching for Texas. Roansy Contreras expected to go for the Angels. Nothing interesting about Contreras. Scherzer looks good. Bad offense or for the Angels, particularly against right-handed pitching. 22.7% K percentage is middle of the road, but they have an 88 WRC plus. Scherzer through his first few starts this year, a little bit rusty, only striking out 17.7% of hitters, but it is still Max Scherzer. He is most likely going to get back to form sooner than later. And as I mentioned, it is just a good matchup overall against the Angels. The park is good for hitting, but not overly concerned about that. Scherzer threw 90 pitches last time out, so essentially fully stretched out here. He threw 57 in his first start, 77 in his second, 90 in his third. He has also had difficult matchups, so that's another reason that I wouldn't buy too much into his low strikeout percentage so far. He's faced Kansas City, the Orioles, and the Padres. These are all very difficult strikeout matchups for right-handed pitchers. The Padres have the lowest strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching. Baltimore ranks 24th, and Kansas City ranks 27th. So, between it being Scherzer and his track record, and then also the 3 strikeout matchups that he had in his return from the injured list, I'm not putting much weight into him only striking out 17.5% of hitters so far. He looks like a good pitching option. 16% optimal percentage for me, 20% projected ownership. That ownership and optimal percentage will also both go up most likely if we lose Bailey Ober at a very similar price tag. Offensively, I don't really see much reason to get to the Angels. If you were going to go there, I think the case would just be that Scherzer is going to be popular, and it is only his 4th start of the season, so who knows, what kind of shape he's really in. But on a 9 to 11 game slate, I don't think I'll get to the Angels all that much. I would expect to get to the Rangers. They are showing up a ton for me right now. Now, I do think that if you look at the lineup exposure here, like how often Texas is showing up compared to every other team, I do think that comes down, probably just some sort of like wonky early in the day data there. But I do think Texas is one of the clear top stacks on this slate. Contreras does have talent, but he's never really put it together in the major leagues. He most recently pitched on July 4th. He threw 53 pitches. So it's a quasi bullpen game here. I would guess that you're getting, 65, 70 pitches from Contreras. The Angels will probably like him to go like 4 innings or something. But you have a lot of talent for Texas. They're affordably priced. Seager's only 5K. He has not had any issues with his hands since getting hit in that Baltimore series. Homered again last night, hit it like 600 feet. It was absolutely crushed to dead center. He looks good. Semien, Garcia, Langford is cheap. Smith is cheap with MPE, most likely hitting in the middle of the order. Lowe is cheap. This is a really, really appealing stack because not only are they in a good hitter's park and do they have offensive talent, both in terms of stolen bases and home runs, but they're also affordable. So they allow you to get good pitching around them. They allow you to get good secondary stacks or one-offs around them. You can just create really, really high upside lineups. The only concern here is that they are going to be popular. You can see 10 to 15% ownership projected to every hitter 1 through 6. Tavares getting some ownership, hitting, projected to hit 9th. Jonah Heim will still get some ownership at catcher. So the ownership is the concern here, but there are enough other games that you can find, low-owned pitching or low-owned one-offs around them. You can also use them as mini stacks in lower-owned 5-man stacks. So overall, they just look like a very good team here going up against Contreras and the Angels. Atlanta facing Arizona. Chris Sale expected to pitch today for the Braves after being scratched yesterday. He should be popular, nowhere near as popular as he would have been yesterday, but he is still the best pitcher on the slate. 32.7% K percentage, 2.45 xFIP, just pretty much runs laps around everybody else in terms of talent. The Diamondbacks are a competent offense. They are difficult to strike out. Their active roster ranks 26th in strikeout percentage against left-handed pitching at 18.3% since the start of last season. They have a 116 WRC+. It is not an easy matchup, but it is a really, really good pitcher. Showed up as optimal about 17% of the time for me, projected for about 22% ownership. On the other side, Zach Gallen, only 8,900 against this watered-down Atlanta lineup. He looks like a good pitching option as well, and he will only look better if we lose Bailey Ober. Projected for 18% ownership, showed up as optimal 21% of the time. Gallen has a 26.2% strikeout percentage this season, 3.29 xFIP. His strikeout percentage is the third highest on the slate if Ober pitches, second highest if he doesn't. Chris Sale has a higher strikeout percentage. Ober has a higher strikeout percentage today. And then Ryan Pepio and Zach Wheeler, but neither of them are pitching on the main slate. So Gallen is one of your best strikeout pitchers. 3.29 xFIP is better than everybody pitching today, with the exception of Chris Sale, regardless of slate. So one of the most talented pitchers that you can get to, and he's relatively inexpensive at 8,900. The Braves also are just not the same team as normal. They still clearly have good hitters in their lineup, but their active roster against right-handed pitching this year, only a 91 WRC plus, 24.9% K percentage. If Gallen can, just kind of navigate his way through the top of this order, not get lit up by Olsen, Riley, Albies, Ozuna, it's a pretty average lineup after that. Not to say that guys like Sean Murphy and Jared Kelenic and Arcia can't do some damage, but those aren't guys that you're shying away from Zach Gallen because of who they are or how good they are. Obviously, not having Acuna and Harris in this lineup just really shortens the lineup a bit and makes Zach Gallen look quite a bit better, especially when you're getting him at that cheap price tag as well. So I like Gallen quite a bit. Offensively, tough to like either offense, just given the matchups that they have. Both of these pitchers, obviously, very, very good. Chris Sale, not good at holding runners. If Corbin Carroll gets on, he'll probably be running. But on a 9 to 11 game slate, I don't really anticipate playing a lot of Corbin Carroll just in the hopes that he gets on base and can steal. Like, he's 4,900. It's not like you're getting some substantial Chris Sale discount for him. So I wanted to mention that. He's the guy that benefits the most on Arizona from a pitcher that allows stolen bases. But in the context of the slate, I don't really think it matters all that much. Maybe something to keep in mind for the night slate where you only have 4 games and Chris Sale will be way more popular than he is on the main. You could play Carroll with Sale. You could use Carroll as leverage against him on that shorter slate, but I don't think it's really actionable on this main slate. Don't anticipate getting to either offense too much. If you were going to do it, it would be in your larger field tournaments with the mindset that both pitchers are popular and both offenses obviously have talent. And when they do well, they score a lot of fantasy points because they have speed, they have power upside, but both of these pitchers are very, very good. Mariners are facing the Padres in San Diego. It's been a hitter-friendly park so far this year. Logan Gilbert going for Seattle. Adam Mazur on the mound for San Diego. Not much interest in either pitcher. Gilbert is the more talented of the two by a pretty wide margin, but he does have a tough matchup. I mentioned it a minute ago talking about Scherzer, but the Padres have the lowest strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year. Gilbert is good, 24% K percentage, 3.54 xFIP. It is by default a park downgrade for him, no matter what you think Petco Park is. Like I said, it's been a very favorable hitter's park this year. Generally, it is a below average hitter's park to neutral at best. Even if you just want to call it neutral, that's still a pretty big park downgrade from where Gilbert pitches his home games in Seattle. So as a result, he's a little bit overpriced for the park. And then again, you get the very difficult strikeout matchup too. Now, from a talent standpoint, if you are playing, let's say you're stacking the Rangers, for example, and you're taking on all of that ownership in a 5-man stack, then somebody like Gilbert, if you can afford him, makes a lot of sense because you're still getting a very talented pitcher at a lot less ownership than the other talented pitchers on the slate. But generally, I differentiate with bats a lot more than I do with pitching. So I expect I'll probably just end up in that like 5 to 10% range on Logan Gilbert. I don't anticipate needing to get to Mazur. It is a good strikeout matchup for him against Seattle, but I just don't really think that you're going to need to go there on this slate. So far this season, limited sample, but only a 12.3% strikeout percentage. His walk percentage is higher than his strikeout percentage. Hasn't been very good so far in the majors. Obviously, Mariners have a relatively high implied run total here, so I don't anticipate getting to Mazur against them. The Mariners look fine as a stack. It's a park upgrade. How much of a park upgrade it is obviously depends on exactly how you are quantifying Petco this year, but it is a better hitter's park than Seattle because Seattle is the worst. So Julio Rodriguez, if he is in the lineup at 5K, he's been a pretty unlucky hitter so far this year. Hasn't hit for a lot of power, but quality of contact's been pretty good. He's been one of the more unlucky guys in terms of expected results versus actual. Happy to get to him if he is in the lineup. Gives you, some stolen base upside as well. Mazur so far only allowing a 119 expected ISO to lefties, to righties, 104 to lefties. So while he hasn't been very good overall, it's been walks a lot more than power allowed, which isn't ideal for an opposing team. But there is a lot of power, and it's reasonably priced in the Mariners lineup. Rodriguez, Raleigh at 4,400. Raley at 4,200, Polanco only 3,300, probably hitting toward the top of the order. So the Mariners look okay. I think they're a middle of the road stack. I would keep an eye on what their lineup looks like as well. If Dominic Canzone, for example, is in the lineup and Mitch Haniger is not, or if Luke Raley is in the lineup and Mitch Haniger is not, there is added pinch hit risk for those guys. Stephen Leibowitz said, I was watching the Padres game Sunday on Roku, and they were saying that the park is playing more hitter-friendly in day games in particular. Yeah, that makes sense. Most parks are going to do that just because of obviously being warmer. But the West Coast parks, specifically the ones that have the marine layer, that generally rolls in at night. So during the day, you're going to get a bigger gap typically between how that park plays versus how it plays at night. So I don't have numbers in front of me on that either, but it makes sense logically. That is generally how those parks play. Somebody had mentioned on a show recently that they saw a Reddit thread or an article somewhere or something that they had changed the batter's eye in San Diego, and maybe that's contributing to it being a better offensive park. That generally isn't going to make it the most home run friendly park in baseball. That is probably noise and it's going to come down. But I do think there's a good chance that it's just a better hitter's park now than it has been in the past, even if it's not an elite hitter's park still. Finally, we have the Blue Jays in San Francisco. So a pretty substantial park downgrade for them. Speaking of the marine layer, taking on the Giants, Yusei Kikuchi is pitching for Toronto. Somebody is pitching for San Francisco. Looks like Blake Snell. So I don't know why I don't have him in here. It looks like pitchers coming back from the injured list weren't in my early poll of data, so that makes sense. Blake Snell, 7,800, coming back from a groin injury. He was on the 15-day IL. I don't expect him to be particularly limited. He went 5 innings in his most recent rehab start. I think he should be fine. Hasn't pitched in the majors since June. Maybe they limit him a little bit, but I don't anticipate him being too limited. At 7,800, I think he is playable. I don't love the matchup here. I do like the park. The Blue Jays are tough to strike out. Snell obviously is a good strikeout pitcher. We've seen some ups and downs this year. Has been injured on the injured list a couple of times. Was a little shaky at the start of the season as well. But when he's on, we know he has legit strikeout stuff, has a very high ceiling. So I wouldn't want to get carried away with him. Obviously, I didn't have him in my initial run, so I don't know exactly where he's showing up. He feels like, a 10-ish% guy to me. The salary is low for his overall talent level, so that does mitigate some of the matchup risk. It mitigates some of the pitch count risk. But the problem with Blake Snell is that even when he's not on a pitch count, you can't count on him to go deep into games because he strikes out so many guys and he walks so many guys that's very difficult for him to go like 6 innings. If he's on any sort of a pitch count here, like if they're just limiting him to like 85 pitches, that can still just be 4 innings. And I think that is certainly possible. As I mentioned, he did go 5 innings in his last rehab start. So I'm not anticipating a major workload restriction, but I also would be kind of surprised if it's just like, oh yeah, go throw 108 pitches today. It's probably somewhere in between. And with Snell, you really do need every pitch you can get. So long story short, or short story long, I think he is just a perfectly okay secondary option that I'm not going to get too excited about because of him returning from the injured list and the tough matchup with Toronto. That being said, I don't really want to get to the Blue Jays bats against him either. Yusei Kikuchi looks pretty good at 8,200. Gets a nice park upgrade facing the Giants. The Giants' active roster has a 23.5% K percentage against left-handed pitching since the start of last season. They do also have a 119 WRC+. Kikuchi's been a good pitcher this year, though. 24.5% K percentage, walking less than 6% of hitters, 3.43 xFIP. He looks good in this park. He's another pitcher that also will look better if Bailey Ober doesn't go. Right now, I think he's actually going a little bit under-owned. He showed up as optimal 20% of the time for me. Fields only projected to get to about 14 to 15% of him. But either way, just looks like another strong mid-range option in this park. San Francisco, if you are going to them because they do have good hitters, keep in mind this is a team that platoons heavily. So pay attention to exactly what their lineup looks like. Jorge Soler, Heliot Ramos, they are the 2 guys I would want to get to first, along with Chapman. Assuming that he's in the lineup, which maybe, oh yeah, there he is. Chapman, Ramos, Soler are the guys I'd want to get to first. You don't have pinch hit risk with those guys. But beyond that, like if you get Luis Matos in there, he's probably getting pinch hit for later in the game. Let me actually double check Toronto's bullpen before I say that. They have two lefty relievers that should be available, Genesis Cabrera and Brendan Little. So most likely, assuming you have some combination of like Conforto, Yastrzemski on the bench, Matos will come out once a right-handed reliever comes in. Tyler Fitzgerald probably will be pinch hit for once a right-handed reliever comes in, depending on who exactly is not starting for the Giants. So keep that in mind. It's a team that platoons heavily. You do get pinch hitters. If Austin Slater's in there, the same thing is going to apply to him. So it does make them difficult to stack. But if you wanted to leverage against Kikuchi, I think you do it with somebody like Jorge Soler, Heliot Ramos, Matt Chapman, guys that aren't going to get pinch hit for and that are also the most likely to do damage. Again, I'm not that interested in Toronto. They have talent if you just wanted to hope that you get bad Blake Snell, but the park downplays power. They don't look all that good. I don't expect Snell to get a ton of ownership. If it turns out that Snell's like 25, 30% owned, then my stance on Toronto will change, but I'm going under the assumption that he won't be. So I am not all that interested in the bats on either side here, but I think my favorite spots to get to would be like Chapman, Soler, Ramos. So that's all 11 games. Again, remember to keep an eye on the weather. We have two games in particular in St. Louis and Chicago that could really be in trouble. If you haven't already signed up for Endgame Syndicate using the link in the description below, our goal there is to make you as good as you can be at DFS, regardless of your style of play. We all play differently, but we are all putting together training videos and we're all accessible in Discord to help you out, make you better on your own, improve your process, hopefully make you less reliant on paying a bunch of monthly subscriptions to a bunch of different places for tools and all of that. So check that out if you haven't already. It's Brick75, Nerdy Tenor, Utica, and myself all giving advice over there. I'll also be back at 5 p.m. Eastern with a tournament-specific show. Did the first one yesterday, had fun doing it, going through what my actual exposures would be looking like at that time, talking strategy, talking why I'm getting to certain things. So definitely check that out. That'll be at 5 p.m. Eastern on the same channel. Other than that, thanks for checking out the show. Have a good rest of your Tuesday.